In the unforgiving heartland, where fortunes are built on grit and destroyed by greed, a new legend is about to be told. Before the harvest begins, offer your tribute. If you believe in the triumph of the underdog, show your support with a like. Join our community by subscribing so you won't miss the secrets buried in the land. Now, prepare yourselves for the silence before the storm and the man who held thunder in his throat. The fluorescent lights of the county bank hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing drone, a sound David Miller had come to associate with the slow, methodical death of hope. Each buzz was a tick of the clock counting down the final moments of his family's legacy. 100 years of sweat and soil evaporating under the sterile, artificial sun of institutional indifference. The air, thick with the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, felt heavy in his lungs, a suffocating blanket of failure. He sat across from Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, a man whose smile was a masterpiece of biological engineering, containing all the physical components of warmth but generating none of its heat. The glass of the desk was cold and unyielding beneath David's trembling hands, a transparent barrier between his world of dirt and debt and Henderson's of numbers and foreclosure. Henderson slid a notice across the polished surface, the paper a stark white flag of surrender that David was being forced to wave. "I'm sorry, David," he'd said, the words coated in a thin, insincere veneer of pity that was more insulting than open contempt. "The numbers are the numbers." David saw not numbers, but the ghost of his grandfather, his hands gnarled like old roots from a lifetime of wrestling life from this very soil. He saw his father gone too soon, a sudden heart attack in the north pasture that had left a void not just in his life, but in the very soul of the farm. His father had entrusted him with this land, this heritage, with a quiet handshake and a look in his eye that said, "Don't be the one to let it go." He saw his own reflection in the spotless glass, a young man aged a decade in 2 years, haunted by the specter of being that one, the one who lost it all. There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. And the truth for David in that sterile, humming office was that he was utterly, terrifyingly alone and on the brink of an abyss. The community that had once rallied around his father now kept a respectful distance, their pity a constant, unspoken reminder of his failure. The friends he'd grown up with were moving on, escaping to cities, leaving the dust and the debt behind. He had tried everything. He'd taken a second mortgage, sold his father's prized John Deere tractor for a fraction of its worth, worked himself to the bone from before dawn until long after dusk. But a year of drought followed by a flash flood that washed out half his soy crop had been the final, brutal blows. The earth itself, the very thing his family had nurtured for a century, had conspired against him. Henderson cleared his throat, a dry, impatient sound. "There is one other option." An investment group made an inquiry about distressed agricultural properties in this county, Apex Global Holdings. "They're willing to make a cash offer, enough to clear your debt and leave you with a little something to start over." The words "start over" landed like a punch to the gut. Start over from what? From 100 years of history, from the only life he had ever known. It was an amputation, not an offer. But the alternative was a sheriff's auction on the courthouse steps, a public execution of his family's name. He had one last, desperate chance, a lifeline thrown by strangers, an offer that felt too good to be true, but one he couldn't afford to refuse. The humiliation of this meeting, the cold finality of Henderson's gaze, was the fire at his back, pushing him toward a deal that would either save him or burn down everything he had ever known. He left the bank feeling hollowed out, the foreclosure notice folded in his pocket like a death sentence. The sun outside was cruelly bright, mocking the darkness that had consumed him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Henderson had already given his name to these investors. The call would come. The vultures were already circling. The call came that very afternoon. The voice on the other end was smooth, confident, and utterly devoid of any real empathy. It belonged to a man who introduced himself as Mr. Wolf, and he spoke of the farm not as a home or a legacy, but as an asset and a parcel. They arranged to meet the following day. David spent the night in a state of suspended dread, wandering the old farmhouse like a ghost. He ran his hand over the marks on the kitchen doorframe where his father had tracked his and his sister's height, a testament to a life that was about to be erased. He sat in his father's worn leather armchair, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco still faintly clinging to it, and felt the crushing weight of his inadequacy. He had failed the man who had believed in him. He had failed the generations who had bled for this land. By the time the sun rose, a grim resolve had settled over him. He would see this through. He would face these men, sign their papers, and walk away with whatever scraps they threw him. Dignity was a luxury he could no longer afford. The arrival of the black SUVs was an alien event, a tear in the fabric of the farm's reality. They moved with a silent, predatory grace down the long gravel driveway, kicking up plumes of golden dust that shimmered in the late afternoon sun. The vehicles, polished to a mirror finish, reflected a distorted, funhouse image of the weathered, peeling paint of the 100-year-old farmhouse. It was a clash of two worlds, the grit and honesty of the land against the cold, manufactured perfection of corporate power. David stood on the porch, his best work shirt damp with sweat, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had tried to make himself presentable, but he felt like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes, about to negotiate the terms of his own surrender. This was it, the last shot. From the back of the barn, partially obscured by the shadow of the great sliding door, Arthur watched. He leaned on a well-worn broom, his movements slow and deliberate as he swept away stray bits of hay and dust that only he seemed to see. To anyone who noticed him, and few ever did, he was just part of the landscape, as fixed and silent as the old oak tree that dominated the front yard. His face was a roadmap of lines etched by sun and time, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. He was a man who had perfected the art of being overlooked. He had arrived 5 years ago, a drifter asking for work, and David's father, a man who trusted his gut more than a resume, had given him a job and a room in the old foreman's cottage. Arthur rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, his English functional but clipped, as if the language were an ill-fitting coat. He worked with a silent, tireless efficiency, mending fences, tending to the livestock, and patching the perpetually leaking barn roof. He was a ghost in worn denim, a fixture David had long since taken for granted. But Arthur saw. He saw the tension in David's shoulders, the desperate hope warring with crippling fear. He saw the men who emerged from the SUVs, their suits sharp enough to cut, their smiles wide but their eyes narrow and calculating, scanning the property not for its beauty but for its exploitable weaknesses. He recognized the type instantly. He'd seen them in different cities, in different languages, but their predatory hunger was a universal dialect. Vultures. The lead investor, a man who introduced himself as Mr. Wolf, strode toward the porch with the unearned confidence of someone who had never known a day of physical labor. He was tall, with silver hair swept back from a tanned forehead, and he moved like he owned not just the ground he walked on, but the very air he breathed. His handshake was firm and brief, a dismissal disguised as a greeting. "David," he boomed, his voice a smooth baritone that felt rehearsed, calibrated for maximum effect. "A pleasure. You have a beautiful piece of history here." The words were a compliment, but the tone was pure condescension, the way one might admire a quaint antique before hauling it to the dump. Wolf's gaze swept over the farmhouse, the barns, the fields stretching to the horizon, not with appreciation, but with the cold appraisal of a butcher eyeing a prize steer. His associate, a younger man named Klaus with the cold, watchful eyes of a reptile, followed a step behind, his silence somehow more unnerving than Wolf's practiced charm. They moved inside, into the living room that smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and David's simmering anxiety. The investors took up space, their presence shrinking the familiar room, making the worn furniture look shabby and small. They were a contamination, their expensive cologne warring with the honest scent of the house. Arthur, following a quiet, prearranged instruction from David, entered a few moments later carrying a tray with a pot of coffee and a few mismatched mugs. He moved with a quiet efficiency that made him almost invisible, his footsteps soft on the groaning floorboards. He set the tray down on the coffee table, his calloused hands steady, his gaze downcast, avoiding any eye contact. Wolf didn't even acknowledge him, too busy spreading a sheaf of papers across the antique oak table. The contract. It was thick, an imposing stack of legalese bound in a crisp blue folder, a testament to the farm's entire history, reduced to fine print and signature lines. Arthur poured the coffee, the dark liquid steaming into the tense air, and then retreated to a corner of the room, picking up his broom again, resuming a task that needed no doing. He was just the help, a ghost in the corner. It was a role he had perfected over the years, a camouflage that had served him well in far more dangerous rooms than this one. He swept, and he listened, and he waited. The contract lay on the table like a coiled snake. Its sheer volume was an act of intimidation, a physical manifestation of a world David did not understand. Each page was a dense forest of clauses and subclauses, a language designed to confuse, not clarify. Mr. Wolf waved a dismissive hand over it, his gold signet ring flashing in the lamplight like a hypnotic pendulum. It's all standard boilerplate, David, just the usual legal necessities. His voice was a soothing balm intended to numb the recipient's critical faculties. Asset transfer, liability waivers, my legal team is meticulous. He smiled again, that predator's smile that showed teeth but no soul. Frankly, we're being incredibly generous here. This offer is well above market value for a property like this. The unspoken words hung in the air, for a failing farm run by a desperate kid. The condescension was a physical thing, a pressure in David's chest. He picked up the top page. The paper felt heavy, official, final. He scanned the words, but they swam before his eyes, a meaningless jumble of legal jargon. He could make out phrases like mineral rights, subsurface exploration, and irrevocable transfer, but they were abstract concepts, disconnected from the soil he walked on every day, the soil that held the sweat of his ancestors. He felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was his grandfather's land, his father's legacy. He was about to sign it away to a man he'd met less than an hour ago, a man who looked at his home as nothing more than an entry on a balance sheet. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the document. The room felt hot, the air thin. I should probably have my lawyer look at this," he mumbled, the words feeling weak and foolish as soon as they left his mouth. He didn't have a lawyer he could afford. Mr. Henderson at the bank was the closest thing he had to a financial advisor, and he was the one holding the axe over his neck. Wolf's smile tightened by a fraction of an inch, the first crack in his charming facade. "Of course you could do that," he said, his tone shifting from paternal to impatient. "But our offer is time-sensitive. We have other properties we're looking at. This price is for today, David. A quick, clean solution to your problems." He gestured vaguely, a gesture that encompassed the overdue notices on the mantelpiece, the peeling paint on the walls, the weight of generations pressing down on David's young shoulders. Tomorrow, who knows, the market shifts, our investors get cold feet. It was a classic pressure tactic, squeezing a man who was already gasping for air. David felt the walls of the room closing in. The bank, the foreclosure, the shame. He looked at the signature line, his name waiting to be written, a final act of surrender. In the corner, the rhythmic asterisk swoosh swoosh asterisk of Arthur's broom was a steady, unobtrusive sound, the quiet soundtrack to a man's life being signed away. Arthur watched Wolf's eyes. He had seen those eyes before, in boardrooms in Zurich and back alleys in Damascus. They were the eyes of a man who saw other people not as human beings, but as assets or obstacles. Right now, David was an asset to be liquidated, and Arthur, the silent farmhand, was less than an obstacle. He was nothing, a piece of the scenery, which was exactly how he wanted it. The pressure in the room became a palpable force, pressing down on David, whose hand reached for the pen Wolf offered, a sleek, heavy instrument of silver and gold. It felt like a weapon aimed at his own heart. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken anxieties. David's fingers trembled as they closed around the pen. The silver felt cold, alien, a foreign object in a hand more accustomed to the warmth of wood and the grit of soil. The tip hovered over the paper, a millimeter away from sealing the fate of a century of his family's sweat and toil. Mr. Wolf watched him, a hawk observing its prey, the facade of patience wearing thin. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. This was taking too long. This rural fool, this simple farmer, was actually thinking about it. The arrogance was astounding. With a sigh of theatrical exasperation, Wolf turned to his associate Klaus, who had remained silent throughout the negotiation, a coiled spring of menace in the corner of the room. The switch was instantaneous. The charming English vanished, replaced by the sharp, guttural consonants of German. Biel dich Klaus, wir haben nicht den ganzen Tag Zeit, asterisk Wolf snapped, his voice low and dismissive. Hurry up, Klaus. We don't have all day. He gestured with his chin toward David, a gesture of utter contempt. Dieser Idiot hat keine Ahnung, das auf einer Goldmine sitzt. Ein Unterschrift, das alles gehört uns. This idiot has no idea he's sitting on a gold mine. One signature and all this is ours. Klaus smirked, a conspiratorial glint in his eye. He picked up one of the mismatched mugs from the table and sniffed the contents with disdain, his nose wrinkling. Der Kaffee ist schrecklich, he added, his German clipped and precise. And the coffee is terrible. Wolf let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of warmth. Was wordt du, wir sind in der Welt. Sobald Unterschreibt, kommt morgen der Bulldozer für das Haus. Die Lithium vorkommen sind Milliarden wert. Wir werden einen Scheck ausstellen, der für ein Jahr glücklich macht, während wir des Vermögens Ergrisvaters aus dem Boden ziehen. Asterisk, what do you expect? We're in the middle of nowhere. Once he signs, the bulldozer comes for the house tomorrow. The lithium reserves are worth billions. We'll write him a check that will keep him happy for a year while we pull his great-grandfather's fortune out of the ground. They both chuckled, a private, ugly sound, sharing a joke at the expense of the man whose life they were about to dismantle. They were so cocooned in their own arrogance, so certain of their intellectual and cultural superiority, that they spoke as if they were alone in an empty room. The young farmer was a piece of furniture, and the old man sweeping in the corner. He was less than that. He was dust. In that corner, the rhythmic sweeping stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than a shout. It was a puncture in the fabric of the room's atmosphere. For the first time, the two investors and David turned their attention to the old farmhand. Arthur stood perfectly still, the broom held loosely in one hand. His head was slightly bowed, but as he lifted it, the pale, washed-out blue of his eyes seemed to sharpen, to harden into something as cold and clear as Arctic ice. He looked directly at Mr. Wolf, holding his gaze with an unnerving intensity that stripped away the investor's smug superiority. He took one slow step away from the wall, then another. The floorboards creaked under his worn work boots, each sound an indictment in the suffocating silence. He walked not like a farmhand, but with a straight-backed, measured gait that spoke of discipline and authority. He stopped at the edge of the oak coffee table standing between Wolf and David, a quiet, unassuming wall. The air crackled with a new, dangerous energy. David stared, bewildered. What was Arthur doing? This was madness. Arthur's gaze never left Wolf's face. The investor's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance that quickly curdled into confusion. Who was this old field hand to interrupt his closing? "Can we help you?" Wolf asked in English, his tone dripping with a condescension that now sounded hollow and forced. Arthur ignored the English. He looked at the half-full mug of coffee Klaus was still holding. Then his eyes locked back onto Wolf's, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, level, and utterly fluent. The German that came from his lips was not the clipped, businesslike dialect of Wolf and his partner. It was a more refined, almost aristocratic High German, the kind spoken in lecture halls in Heidelberg or diplomatic functions in Berlin, each syllable perfectly enunciated. "Der Kaffee mag schlecht sein, Herr Wolf," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. "Aber Ihr Vertrag ist criminal." "The coffee might be bad, Mr. Wolf, but your contract is criminal." The room froze. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the world into a state of suspended animation. Wolf's jaw went slack, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Klaus, his partner, actually flinched, the coffee mug rattling in his hand. They stared at the old man in the dirt-stained clothes as if he had just sprouted wings and breathed fire. The idea that this silent, simple-minded rustic could understand them, let alone speak their language with such flawless, biting precision, was so far outside their realm of possibility that their minds couldn't immediately process it. It was a system error, a glitch in their perfectly ordered, hierarchical world where men like Arthur were invisible. David was the first to break the spell, his voice a bewildered whisper, the pen falling from his numb fingers and clattering onto the floor. "Arthur, you speak German." He looked back and forth between the impassive farmhand and the stunned investors, his mind reeling. Arthur had worked for his family for 5 years. He barely spoke English. He was the man who fixed fences, mucked out stalls, and patched the barn roof. He was quiet, dependable, simple, or so everyone had thought. Arthur didn't answer David. He didn't even look at him. His entire focus, his entire being, was laser-focused on Mr. Wolf. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been shattered and completely rearranged. A moment ago, Wolf was the master of this universe, the man with all the power, all the information. Now he was exposed, vulnerable, staring at a ghost from a world he thought he controlled. Arthur's pale blue eyes were no longer vacant. They were analytical, piercing, the eyes of a man who could strip away layers of deception with a single glance. He had spent a lifetime reading men like Wolf, men who draped their greed in fine suits and smoother words. Who are you?" Wolf stammered, the German words catching in his throat, his composure completely gone. The arrogant investor had vanished, replaced by a cornered, confused man. Arthur allowed a sliver of a smile to touch his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a chilling certainty. He reached forward, his calloused farmer's hand, the one they had ignored, and tapped a single, long finger on the thick contract that lay between them. The sound was like a gavel falling. He was no longer the servant. He was the judge, and the trial was about to begin. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was heavy with the weight of secrets about to be unearthed, lies about to be brought into the light. With his finger still resting on the contract, Arthur finally broke his intense gaze with Wolf and turned his head slightly toward David. He still did not address him directly. His words were for the entire room, a public indictment delivered in a calm, measured English that was as startlingly clear and precise as his German had been. He said, Arthur began, his voice devoid of emotion, a simple vessel for the truth, that you were an idiot sitting on a gold mine. He said that once you signed, this would all be theirs. He paused, letting the weight of the betrayal sink into David's soul. David's face went pale, a slow tide of comprehension and horror washing over him, followed by a flush of burning shame. They had seen him as a fool. They had laughed at him. Arthur continued, his voice relentless, each word a hammer blow dismantling the fragile structure of hope David had built around this deal. He said the bulldozer would be here tomorrow to demolish this house. He gestured with his free hand to the room around them, to the photographs on the mantel, the worn armchair where David's father used to sit, the history they were about to erase. Because the lithium reserves under this land are worth billions. Wolf found his voice, sputtering in English now, scrambling to regain control of a situation that had spun into a nightmare. This is absurd. He's misinterpreting a private conversation, a joke between colleagues. Arthur didn't even look at him. He slid the contract toward himself and flipped through the pages with an unnerving familiarity, as if he had already read and memorized the entire document in the dim light of the room. He stopped 2/3 of the way through, his finger landing on a specific block of text with unerring accuracy. It's not a joke, Mr. Wolf. It's right here. He looked at David, his eyes now conveying a silent command to pay attention. Paragraph 12, Section C, transfer of subsurface rights. It's buried under a heading about agricultural water easements, a classic misdirection. It gives your company, or rather, the Luxembourg-based Shell Corporation to which you will immediately transfer the deed, irrevocable and exclusive rights to all mineralogical assets found on, or beneath, the property in perpetuity. He looked up from the page, his eyes locking back onto Wolf's. Perpetuity is a long time, Mr. Wolf. Long after the generous check you were planning to write has been spent. The precision of his language, the casual use of terms like Shell Corporation and perpetuity, was another shockwave that rocked the room. This was not the vocabulary of a farmhand. This was the language of his own world, the world of international finance and law, thrown back in his face by the man he had dismissed as dust. David stared at the page Arthur indicated, the words finally coming into focus, the legal jargon now imbued with a terrifying, concrete meaning. They weren't just buying his farm. They were stealing the earth beneath it, the secret wealth he never knew he had, for pennies on the dollar. The generosity was a lie. The whole thing was a meticulously crafted scam, hidden in plain sight, and they had laughed about it right in front of him. The humiliation burned hotter than the fear had. Wolf, now desperate, rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger and panic. He tried to project authority, but the foundation had been ripped out from under him. "This is insane," he boomed, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "He's a crazy old man, a disgruntled employee. David, you can't possibly listen to this nonsense. We have a legally binding offer on the table." Arthur remained seated, an island of calm in the eye of the storm Wolf was trying to create. He looked up at the flustered executive with an expression that was almost pitying. Your offer is predicated on fraud, Mr. Wolf. That tends to invalidate things. Then Arthur's voice dropped, becoming quieter, more personal, and infinitely more menacing. And I am far from disgruntled. In fact, I find my work here quite peaceful. He leaned forward slightly, the movement drawing all the energy in the room toward him. But it does get boring sometimes. So I read. I keep up with things. For instance, I read about a company called Apex Global Holdings, your primary investment vehicle. And I remember a very similar land deal that went south in the Atacama Desert in Chile about 8 years ago. A local cooperative pushed off their ancestral lands for a pittance, only for Apex to announce a massive copper deposit 6 months later. The deal was brokered by a man with a penchant for German sports cars and an allergy to regulatory oversight. That man's name was also Wolf. Klaus, the associate, took an involuntary step back, his face ashen. This wasn't a lucky guess. This was intelligence. This was a targeted strike. Arthur wasn't finished. He continued in that same soft, deadly tone, dismantling Wolf's entire life piece by piece. I also know that Apex Global is financed primarily through a holding company in Zurich, a company that has been flagged twice by international financial regulators for its opaque ownership structure. I know your silent partner, a man named Richter, prefers to handle his business from a yacht in the Mediterranean to avoid extradition treaties with most of Western Europe and the United States. He paused, letting the information settle like poison in the air. These are not things a crazy old man would know, are they, Mr. Wolf? These are things someone who spent 20 years tracking the international flow of illicit capital might know. He finally stood up, his full height not imposing but his presence filling the room, suffocating the lies. He was no longer Arthur the farmhand. He was someone else entirely, someone forged in a world of shadows and secrets, a world where men like Wolf were the prey, not the hunters. He looked at Wolf, and for the first time, Wolf saw not a simpleton but a predator far more dangerous than himself. "You stepped onto the wrong farm," Arthur said, the words of final, quiet judgment. "You underestimated the locals." The bluff had been called, the hand revealed. Wolf had nothing left to play. His empire of deceit had been brought down by a man with a broom. The spell of fear that had held David captive for months shattered. The ice in his veins melted, replaced by a surge of pure, cleansing rage that rose up from his gut. He looked at the contract on the table, this symbol of his desperation, this weapon of their deceit. He saw Wolf's sneering, arrogant face. He heard the echo of their laughter. He remembered the cold pity in Henderson's eyes, and he was done. Done being a victim, done being afraid, done being the boy who was losing the farm. With a swift, decisive movement, he snatched the thick document from the table. The sharp sound of tearing paper ripped through the tense silence, a sound more satisfying than any music. He tore it in half, then in half again, the pages scattering onto the worn wooden floor like dead leaves. The pieces of paragraph 12, section C, the legal heart of the scam, fluttered down around Wolf's expensive Italian shoes. "Get out," David said. His voice didn't tremble. It was low and steady, imbued with an authority he didn't know he possessed. It was the voice of his grandfather, the voice of his father, the voice of a man who owned the ground he stood on. Wolf stared at the shredded contract, his face a contorted mask of disbelief and fury. All that planning, all that money, the billions waiting just beneath the soil, gone. Destroyed by a silent old man and the boy he had dismissed as an idiot. "You have no idea what you've just done," Wolf hissed, his voice venomous, spitting the words. "You'll be bankrupt in a week. I'll make sure of it. The bank will own this pile of dirt before you can cash your next welfare check." David took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He was no longer the frightened young man from the bank. He was the guardian of this land, and his anger was a righteous fire. I said, "Get off my land." He pointed a rigid finger toward the door, his whole body a declaration of ownership. Now, there was no arguing with the finality in his tone. The charm was gone, the threats were empty. They were exposed, humiliated. Klaus was already backing toward the door, eager to escape the blast radius of his boss's failure. Wolf gave Arthur one last look, a mixture of hatred and a new, chilling fear. Who was this man? What had he stumbled into? He turned without another word and stalked out of the house, his composure shredded as thoroughly as his contract. David and Arthur stood on the porch and watched the black SUVs retreat down the gravel drive. This time not with silent grace, but in a hurried, panicked cloud of dust, like thieves fleeing a crime scene. They disappeared over the rise, and a profound silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of wind in the cornfields. The farm felt like it could breathe again. The air was clean, free of the cloying scent of cologne and deceit. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving David feeling hollowed out, shaky. He leaned against a porch column, the solid wood a comforting presence at his back. He looked at the man standing beside him, a man he had worked with side by side for 5 years, a man he thought he knew. He realized he knew nothing at all. The silence stretched between them, no longer the comfortable quiet of shared work, but a space filled with 1,000 unanswered questions. Finally, David found his voice, the question coming out as a simple, heartfelt plea. "Arthur, who are you?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He looked out over the fields, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the setting sun was painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The golden hour light softened the hard lines of his face, making him look less like an executioner and more like the quiet man who fixed the fences. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of soil and approaching twilight. "I was someone else for a very long time," he said, his voice returning to its usual quiet cadence, the hard, authoritative edge gone. "A man who dealt in the world's noise. Whispers in crowded embassies, shouts in war-torn streets, the static of lies over encrypted channels." He turned his head to look at David, and his pale eyes held a deep, ancient weariness. "My job was to listen, to understand what people said when they thought no one was listening. German, Russian, Farsi, Arabic, the language didn't matter. The currency was always the same, secrets and deceit. He spoke of it not with pride, but with a profound sense of exhaustion, as if recounting a long and debilitating illness. Berlin after the wall fell, Beirut during the Civil War, places where trust was a commodity you couldn't afford and a single misunderstood word could get people killed. I spent 30 years in that world, first for the government, then for people who paid better. It grinds you down. The noise gets inside you. You start to see traps and lies everywhere in everyone. You lose the ability to see the good." He paused, looking down at his own hands, calloused and stained with the honest dirt of the farm. "When it was over, when I was done, I just wanted quiet. I drove west until the cities were gone, until the roads turned to gravel. I was looking for a place where a fence was just a fence, not a border, where a man's word meant something, where the work was hard and the results were real. You fix a post, it stays fixed. You plant a seed, it grows." He gave a small, sad smile. "It's honest. This farm is honest." He had shown up one day, years ago, asking for work. David's father, a good judge of character, had seen something in the quiet man's eyes, not simplicity, but a deep need for peace, and hired him. He never asked about his past, and Arthur never offered it. He became a fixture, a silent, steady presence. "I came here to forget the noise of the world," Arthur finished, his gaze returning to the fields. I stayed because I found a place that was worth protecting from it. For the first time, David understood. Arthur wasn't just a farmhand, he was a guardian. He hadn't been hiding on the farm, he had been standing watch over it. The quiet wasn't emptiness, it was vigilance. The relief of chasing Wolf off the property was a brief, intoxicating high that was quickly replaced by the cold, hard reality of their situation. The immediate threat was gone, but the original one, the bank, the foreclosure, the crushing weight of debt, remained, now more menacing than ever. The torn contract was a moral victory, but it didn't put money in the bank. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the yard, David's brief surge of empowerment gave way to a familiar, gnawing anxiety. "What do we do now, Arthur?" he asked, the question heavy with desperation. "Henderson will be calling tomorrow. The foreclosure is still happening. Wolf was right about that much. He'll make sure the bank comes for us now, and fast." Arthur nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Wolf is a predator, but even predators can be useful. They sniff out valuable things. He looked at David, his eyes sharp and analytical again. He wasn't lying about the lithium. He was just lying about its value to you. He gave us the map. We just have to claim the treasure before his friends do. He pulled a small, battered flip phone from his pocket, a relic from another era that was clearly designed for durability, not features. "The world I left behind. It was built on a network of favors, debts, and information. Most of those contacts are dead, retired, or would rather not hear from me. But not all of them." He scrolled through a tiny, pixelated contact list with his thumb. He stopped on a single entry. "Harding. Dr. Alistair Harding," Arthur said. "One of the best geologists in the world. He spent 10 years mapping mineral deposits for the government before he got disillusioned and went private. He owes me a big favor. From a misunderstanding in Bogota involving a briefcase, a corrupt official, and some poorly translated mining permits. He was about to spend a long time in a very unpleasant prison." A faint, wry smile touched his lips. "It's time to call it in." The phone call was short and cryptic. Arthur spoke in quiet, clipped sentences, giving coordinates and a brief, technical summary that made David's head spin. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with what sounded like sputtered disbelief. Then Arthur said, "Yes, Alistair, it's that important. I'm calling in the marker." He listened for another moment. "Thank you." He flipped the phone shut. "He'll have a team here with a ground-penetrating radar and a core sampler in 48 hours. He'll do it off the books as a private consultation. We'll have a real survey, an honest one." The next morning, the inevitable call came. It was Mr. Henderson from the bank. His voice, once dripping with false sympathy, was now as cold and sharp as chipped ice. "David, I received a rather interesting call from a Mr. Wolf. He informs me you've rejected his very generous offer. He was quite upset. Said you had some crazy old man working for you who sabotaged the deal. It wasn't generous, it was a scam, and Arthur saved me from it," David said, his own voice steady, bolstered by Arthur's calm presence beside him at the kitchen table. Henderson scoffed, a nasty, rasping sound. "A scam that would have paid off your debts. You had a solution and you tore it up. As it stands, the bank will be initiating repossession proceedings at the end of the week. I've already filed the paperwork. I hope you have another miracle lined up, son. The clock is ticking." The line went dead. The threat was clear. The deadline was real. They had less than a week to turn a geological survey into salvation. The wait was agonizing, a new kind of torture. The fate of the farm no longer rested in the hands of men in suits, but in the secrets held deep within the earth itself. The 2 days felt like 2 years. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every gust of wind, sounded like the arrival of the sheriff with an eviction notice. David found it impossible to sleep. his mind a frantic carousel of worst-case scenarios. He saw the auction signs going up on his fences, his neighbors picking through the remnants of his family's life, Henderson and Wolf sharing a celebratory drink. To fight the panic, he and Arthur worked. They mended fences, turned the soil, the familiar rhythms of the farm a fragile defense against the encroaching chaos. They spoke little, but a new bond had been forged between them in the crucible of that confrontation, a bond of shared purpose and mutual respect. David found himself watching Arthur, trying to reconcile the quiet farmhand with the man who had dismantled an international predator with a few chosen words. On the third morning, just as the sun was beginning to burn the mist off the fields, a dusty, unmarked panel van rumbled up the driveway. A man with a wild mane of white hair and a sun-weathered face that looked like a friendly cliff face stepped out. Dr. Harding. He greeted Arthur with a firm handshake and a look of deep curiosity mixed with old camaraderie. "Last time I saw you, Arthur, you were wearing a much better suit, and you told me to forget your name," he said with a wry grin. "Last time I saw you, Alistair, you were explaining to the Colombian Federals why you had a seismic detonator in your luggage," Arthur retorted dryly. "I thought you could use a change of scenery." Harding's team worked with a quiet, professional intensity that was awe-inspiring. They deployed equipment that looked like it belonged on a mission to Mars, rolling out cables and setting up sensor arrays. The ground-penetrating radar hummed to life, its screen displaying a ghostly, layered image of the world beneath their feet. For hours they scanned, mapped, and cross-referenced, their movements precise and economical. David watched, his heart in his throat, feeling like a bystander at his own open-heart surgery. This was it, the moment of truth. If Wolf had been wrong, if it was all a bluff, they were finished. Finally, Harding, poring over a topographic map covered in his own scribbled notations, pointed to a rocky outcrop on the farm's northern pasture, a place David had only ever known for being too stony to plow. "There," he said, his voice laced with a controlled excitement. "The deposit concentration is highest there. If it's as rich as the GPR suggests, well, let's just say Mr. Wolf wasn't exaggerating about the gold mine part." The core sampler was a beast of a machine, its diamond-tipped drill biting into the earth with a high-pitched scream that echoed across the valley. It took hours to reach the target depth. The tension was unbearable. David felt the future of his family balancing on the tip of that drill. Then, the first core sample was pulled from the ground. It was a long, cylindrical section of rock. Harding laid it carefully in a padded case, broke it open with a specialized hammer, and examined the cross-section with a jeweler's loupe. He ran a small handheld scanner over it, which beeped with increasing intensity until it let out a sustained, high-pitched tone. A wide, incredulous grin spread across his face. He looked up at David and Arthur, his eyes shining. "It's not just rich," he said, his voice full of wonder. "It's one of the purest spodumene pegmatite deposits I've ever seen. High-grade, easily accessible. David, you're not sitting on a gold mine. You're sitting on a mountain of white gold." The official report from Harding's lab arrived 2 days later via a secure, encrypted email. The numbers were staggering, confirming a lithium reserve that was, by conservative estimates, worth several $billion. It was a fortune so vast it was almost impossible to comprehend, an abstract concept that had no connection to David's reality of overdue bills and patched tires. He felt dizzy looking at the screen, but Arthur remained grounded, his calm a necessary anchor in the storm of David's emotions. "The wealth isn't the power," he told David, looking at the report on the laptop screen. "The asterisk knowledge of the wealth is the power. Wolf had it and you didn't. Now you do, but knowledge is useless without action and our clock is still ticking." Arthur made another call, this time not to a geologist, but to a lawyer in New York he knew from his old life, a woman named Isabella Rossi, who specialized in negotiating resource rights against predatory corporations. She was sharp, ruthless, and, according to Arthur, owed him for getting her younger brother out of a very bad situation involving the Russian mafia in Eastern Europe years ago. "She eats men like wolf for breakfast," Arthur had said, "and she never forgets a favor." Armed with Harding's ironclad geological survey, Rossi went to work. But just as a sliver of hope began to dawn, a new crisis emerged, born of Wolf's vengeful fury. A courier arrived with a legal notice. A priority lien had been placed against the farm. It wasn't from the bank, but from a previously unknown creditor, a logistics company that claimed David's father had an outstanding, unpaid debt of nearly $200,000 for shipping equipment, a debt that was now being called in. The documentation looked official, the claim airtight. David was stunned. He knew nothing of this. "It's a ghost debt," Arthur said grimly, examining the paperwork. "Wolf fabricated it. The logistics company is another of his shell corporations. He's trying to tie the property up in legal knots, bleed us dry with court fees, and delay us long enough for the bank to foreclose. It's a classic corporate chokehold." The brief moment of triumph evaporated, replaced by a new, more insidious kind of dread. They had the treasure map, but Wolf was trying to bury them alive before they could use it. Isabella Rossi's voice on the speakerphone was a blade of steel. "It's a clever, nasty move. Proving the debt is fraudulent could take months in court, and you don't have months. You have days. Henderson is pushing the foreclosure through on an accelerated schedule. Wolf is squeezing you from one side, the bank from the other." The trap was closing. For a moment, David felt the old despair wash over him. It was hopeless. The system was rigged, and men like Wolf would always win. "No," Arthur said, his voice cutting through David's panic. "He's overplayed his hand. He's acting out of anger, not strategy. He's left a trail." For the next 12 hours, Arthur and Rossi worked in tandem, a two-person army waging a war across time zones. Arthur, using his old, shadowy instincts, guided Rossi through the labyrinth of international corporate law. He pointed her towards specific jurisdictions known for lax oversight, named individuals who had a history of facilitating Wolf's schemes. He was a human intelligence agency, drawing on a mental database of corruption and greed built over 30 years. Rossi, in turn, used that intelligence to launch a legal blitzkrieg. She filed emergency injunctions, subpoenaed records from offshore banks, and unleashed a torrent of legal pressure that Wolf and his lawyers were not prepared for. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning. Rossi found it, a digital breadcrumb. The timestamp on the invoice for the ghost debt was dated 2 days after Wolf's visit to the farm. It was an impossible contradiction, a sloppy mistake made in anger. It was the proof they needed that the lien was a malicious fabrication. "We have him," Rossi said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "I'm sending this to the judge overseeing the foreclosure and to the state attorney general's office. This isn't just a civil matter anymore. This is criminal fraud." Wolf's attack had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. The threat of a state investigation into his business practices was enough to make him and his ghost lien vanish. The bank, now faced with evidence of collusion with a fraudulent actor, immediately halted the foreclosure proceedings. Henderson was suddenly very cooperative. The chokehold was broken. They were free. Within days, the landscape shifted entirely. They weren't desperately seeking a buyer. They were fielding offers. Rossi, using Harding's survey as a battering ram, had bypassed the usual channels and gone directly to the CEOs of the world's largest, most legitimate mining and energy companies. A bidding war erupted. David and Arthur sat in the farmhouse kitchen, listening on speakerphone as Rossi orchestrated a high-stakes auction for the rights to their land. Representatives from Tokyo, London, and Houston made offers in the hundreds of millions, then in the billions. It was surreal, listening to these titans of industry fight over the stony pasture where David used to chase stray cows. But Arthur and Rossi had structured a different kind of deal, one designed for legacy, not just a lottery win. They wouldn't sell the land. They wouldn't sell the rights in perpetuity. They would lease the subsurface rights in a partnership agreement. A 20-year lease with an option to renew, a significant upfront signing bonus, and, most importantly, a percentage of the gross profits from every ton of lithium extracted. It gave David and his family generational security without sacrificing their ownership of the land itself. The final deal was struck with a green energy consortium from Germany, a poetic irony that was not lost on Arthur. The day the deal was finalized, a wire transfer appeared in the farm's struggling bank account. The number had so many zeros that David had to count them 3 times. It was a life-altering, history-defining sum. The debt was gone. The threat of foreclosure was a distant memory. The first thing he did was buy a new tractor, a massive, gleaming green machine that sat in the barn like a monument to their victory. The second thing he did was repair the barn roof properly, hiring a full crew. He was no longer just saving the farm, he was building its future. He walked the fields, the land now his in a way it had never been before. He hadn't just inherited it, he had fought for it. He had won it. The silence of the fields was no longer filled with anxiety, but with the quiet, profound hum of possibility. Months later, the farm was transformed. A new coat of white paint gleamed on the old farmhouse. The porch no longer sagged, and the barn stood proud and strong. The fields were green and thriving, tended with the best equipment money could buy, but David still worked them himself, finding a peace in the soil that no amount of money could provide. But the real transformation was in David. The haunted, desperate look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He walked taller, spoke with a new authority. He had been through the fire and emerged not just unscathed, but forged into something stronger. He had learned the language of power, not to dominate, but to protect. One crisp autumn afternoon, he put on a clean shirt, got into a new but modest pickup truck, and drove into town. He didn't stop at the hardware store or the feed co-op. He parked directly in front of the county bank. He walked through the glass doors, the little bell chiming his arrival. The same fluorescent lights hummed their dreary tune. The air still smelled of disinfectant, but nothing felt the same because he wasn't the same. He walked past the tellers and straight to Mr. Henderson's office, not bothering to knock. Henderson looked up from his paperwork, his face registering surprise, then a flicker of annoyance. "David, do you have an appointment?" he asked, his tone crisp and dismissive, a pathetic attempt to cling to his old authority. "I don't need one," David said calmly, taking a seat in the same chair where he had once trembled with fear. He slid a cashier's check across the cold glass desk. It was for the full, outstanding amount of the farm's mortgage, plus interest. Henderson stared at the check, his eyes widening. He picked it up as if it might burn him. He looked up at David, his professional mask slipping, revealing the weak, petty man beneath. "Where did you get this?" "I found a better investor," David said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He let Henderson process the shock for a moment before continuing. "Actually, I'm not just here to pay off my loan, Mr. Henderson. I'm here to move my assets." He placed a folder on the desk. It contained the financial statements for the new corporation he and Arthur had set up to manage the lithium lease. The numbers inside were astronomical. My new financial advisors feel my capital would be better served at an institution with a bit more vision. Henderson's face went pale. The amount of capital in that folder was more than the entire valuation of his small, regional bank branch. Losing an account that size would be catastrophic for him personally, a black mark on his career from which he would never recover. "Now, David, let's not be hasty," he stammered, his tone shifting instantly from dismissive to desperately fawning. "We've been your family's bank for generations. We can offer you premium rates, private wealth management. We made a mistake." "I made a mistake." David held up a hand, cutting him off. "My family's bank for generations," he repeated, his voice now cold as the glass between them. "And when I was about to lose everything, where was that loyalty? You saw me as a number on a spreadsheet, a bad debt to be cleared. You didn't just fail to help me, you actively pushed me into the arms of a shark like Wolf, hoping he'd clean up your books for you." He stood up, towering over the banker, who now seemed to shrink in his chair. "You see, I've learned something important these last few months, Mr. Henderson. It's not about the money, it's about who you trust with it, and it's about respect. You showed me none." He looked down at the man who had humiliated him and felt not hatred but a kind of pity. Henderson was a prisoner of the same system he served. "I'm taking my business elsewhere, and I'm also considering my next investment. I hear small, local banks with undervalued assets and incompetent management can be quite a bargain. I might just buy this one and make some changes, starting with you." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Henderson speechless and utterly defeated, a man staring into the abyss of his own making. As David stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, he saw Arthur leaning against his new truck, watching. The old man's face was unreadable as always, but as David approached, a genuine, rare smile broke through the weathered landscape of his face. He simply nodded, a sign of profound approval. The student had become the master. The legacy was secure, and the silence they shared now was not one of secrets, but of a deep and abiding victory. And so, their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. Never assume silence is ignorance, for the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you failed to notice. But as one man breaks the system that tried to crush him, another is trapped by a system he built himself. What happens when the very empire you create becomes your most inescapable prison? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.